Contentment is the ability to stop striving internally, even though things on the outside are out of control. And the Apostle Paul said, in Christ, there is an element, there is a way to find and achieve contentment in spite of the fact that you have no control over what's going on around you. Now, real quick little background on the Apostle Paul, and this is so important, especially if you're new to Bible study, or maybe you're very suspect of the scriptures, and you had a freshman English teacher who basically undermined your faith, and you haven't gone back to the Bible since. I understand that. We all had one or two of those. But here's something you need to understand about the Apostle Paul. As you may know, the Apostle Paul steps onto the pages of history as someone who hates Christians. So if you hate Christians, you love the Apostle Paul. You know Christians you'd like to see put in jail. He actually did it, okay? So anyway, the Apostle Paul steps onto the pages of history as the Christian arrestor, right? He becomes one, he becomes a Christian, and then he launches into this incredible missionary endeavor where he's planting churches all over the place. Now, about 10 years in, this is so important, about 10 years into this sort of single-handedly going to conquer the world for Jesus endeavor, about 10 years in, the Apostle Paul is arrested. And he ends up in Rome under house arrest, waiting trial. And as you may know, the emperor at that time was Nero. So to be a Christian in Rome under arrest with Nero as the emperor, that's not a great combination, okay? Because Nero, as we knew, lit his gardens with Christians. Nero, was all about, blaming the Christians for everything he could blame Christians on. So here's the Apostle Paul, Mr., go get him, change the world. He's in Rome under house arrest, and it looks like, from all appearances, Rome won, Jesus lost. The kingdom, the empire of Rome wins, the kingdom of God loses. Nero wins, Jesus loses. I mean, it looks like game over. I mean, here's the guy that, had the responsibility for taking the gospel to the Gentiles, and now he's not only under arrest, he's under arrest in Rome with Nero as the emperor. Now, here's the really cool part, okay? So now you got the Apostle Paul, and understand, he's a very ambitious guy. Okay, he's not whatever. Okay, that's not Paul. Here's this very ambitious guy with this giant vision to change the world. He's under arrest, he's in Rome, and he has nothing to do because he can't go anywhere, he can't do anything. So he decides, I'm not going to waste time. I'm going to write some letters. Little did he know, he was writing some of the most widely read, widely translated literature in all the history of literature. In his mind, there's nothing I can do. I'm stuck here. What am I going to do in the meantime? Well, I'll make the best of it. I'll write a few letters to some Christians in some of these cities where I visited and planted churches. And so he wrote what we know as the letter to Ephesus, or the book of Ephesians. He wrote Colossians. He wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. In fact, these are known as the prison epistles. Now, this is what I want you to get in your head, because this is going to be practical for all of us in just a minute. In his mind, he's just, whatever, there's nothing else I can do. In reality, he is changing the Western world. He's changing the way people view God. He's changing the way Gentiles approach God. He is writing literature that would ultimately be part of undermining the Roman Empire. In fact, what he wrote would be so well read and so published, it would become part of vernacular in multiple languages. In fact, I think I could argue that after the time of Jesus, when Jesus went to heaven, the Apostle Paul had more to do with shaping culture and shaping Western culture than anyone that lived right up until the printing press. And when the printing press finally got underway in about 1450, Gutenberg's press, what's the first book he printed? The Bible. So the first book that was printed, mass produced, if you can think of mass production in 1450, was essentially contained the writings of the Apostle Paul, some of which was written in prison when he was in the meantime moment. Now that's incredible. Nobody here seems to think that's incredible but me. So let me try to kind of jack up the incredible nature of this, okay? Ladies, all right, ladies. Did you know while Paul's in prison, he writes the book of Ephesians? In the book of Ephesians, it says, husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church, and be willing to give your lives for your wives. Aren't you glad Paul went to prison so he could write that? I mean, that's pretty amazing. That's just the beginning. So much of this mind-changing theological literature was written during times of extraordinary adversity. Now, here's the point. This is a big deal. Listen, Paul had no idea Paul had no idea. The Apostle Paul had no idea what hung in the balance of his decision to remain faithful when remaining faithful was difficult. The Apostle Paul had no idea what hung in the balance of his decision to continue to follow Jesus when the circumstances mitigated against it. The Apostle Paul had no idea what God was up to through him. He's just sitting there writing, and in some cases apparently had really bad eyesight. He's dictating, and he says, and somebody's dictating, and he just thinks, well, hopefully these letters will get through. Let me one more thing about this, and we're going to get on with the sermon. What are the odds? I mean, come on. What are the odds that letters written in Rome while under house arrest, what are the odds they even survived the first century, much less became part of the most widely read literature in all of the history of literature? What are the odds of that? I mean, things that emperors wrote, things that emperors dictated have been long lost and long gone. And they put them in vaults and multiple copies and made sure they were protected, for the sake of history. The Apostle Paul is a prisoner. One copy. Deliver this. And we're still reading it today. He had no idea what hung in the balance of his decision to remain faithful. Do you know what hung in the balance? We hung in the balance. The church hung in the balance. And the reason he accomplished what he did, then we're going to move on. Don't miss this. This is so important. The reason he was able to accomplish what he did was because of his adversity and because of his response to his adversity. Now, here's why that's a big deal. I want everybody to pay attention. If you kind of zoned out for a second, this is such a big deal, okay? You have no idea. You have no idea what or who hangs in the balance of your decision to remain faithful when everything around you says be faithless. You have no idea what God might be up to through your faithfulness when everything around you says there's no point in being ethical, there's no point in being moral, there's no point in being faithful, there's no point in staying, there's no point in telling the truth, there's no point in doing it the way it ought to be done, there's no point in being obedient, there's no point in being submissive, there's no point in saying yes to God because there's no win. You're just stuck and you're just, living, for some kind of fantasy out there. You have no idea what hangs in the balance. And the problem is, and the tragedy is, and the challenge is, you'll never know unless you're willing to remain faithful in the midst of adversity. And what you have lived long enough to already learn is simply this, that oftentimes it's within the context of adversity that God does his most amazing things in us and through us and in the world. So this is a big deal. So when you find yourself, as some of you are right now, when we find ourselves in and in the meantime set of circumstances, God is not absent, and God's not apathetic, and God's not angry. As we're going to discover, especially in a few weeks from now, God's oftentimes at work. And the worst thing we could possibly do is to hit the abandon ship button and hit the eject button and somehow try to get ourselves out of circumstances that are only going to complicate our circumstances. Instead of saying, God, I wouldn't choose this for me. God, I wouldn't choose this for an enemy. But here I am. Here I am. Teach me what it means to be content in the midst of these circumstances. So it's in one of these letters, actually the letter that he wrote to the church in Philippians, that he wrote from prison, that the Apostle Paul addresses this issue of contentment. And he makes a big, bold statement that I want to show you, talk about, try to illustrate, and then we'll get you out of here. So here's what he says. He's writing to the church in Philippi from his house arrest in Rome. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He doesn't know when his case will be called up. He assumes that his life will be forfeit because of who's the emperor at the time. So here's what he writes to Christians in the city of Philippi. He says this. He says, I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last, and I'll explain what this means in just a minute, that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. So here's what happened. It's kind of cool. The Apostle Paul's under arrest. News travels slow. So finally, the Christians in Philippi, they get news that, their guy, the guy that started the church, Paul, is under arrest and he's in Rome. So they send him a care package. Well, it takes a long time for the care package to get there. So there's the Apostle Paul rotting away or, kind of just waiting to see what's going to happen. And he gets this care package from his friends in Philippi. And he's like, wow, they didn't forget about me. So he writes in this letter, I'm so glad that you renewed your concern for me. So he's opening the care package and, there's like some books books and a thumb drive, with some cool stuff and video games. Now, we don't know what's in the care package, but he's just maybe a cloak, a coat, it's cold. So he's just very, very grateful. He says, so I'm so glad that you renewed your concern for me. And then he uses this as a launching point to talk about this big, complicated word, contentment. Here's what he says. He says, I'm not saying this because I'm in need. In other words, I'm glad you sent me the care package. I'm glad you remembered me. I'm glad you didn't forget about me. But don't get me wrong. I'm not glad because I was afraid. I'm not glad because I'm, going crazy on the inside. I'm not glad because I'm overwhelmed with anxiety. I'm not saying this because I'm in need for, and here it is, for I have learned. In other words, it took a while. I've learned to process. I have learned this didn't come to me intuitively. I have learned this isn't natural. I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. The idea of content means basically to be internally self-sufficient. I've learned to deal with it. I've learned to not let it drag me down. I've learned to live in such a state that even though things around me are unsure, I'm not stressing out. I'm not striving. I'm not yearning. And I'm not running. I've learned to be content. Now, this is an amazing statement. In whatever circumstances I'm in. Now, if I were to stop the sermon right now and say, hey, thanks for being here, let's close in prayer. I don't know about you, but when I read that, I think that maybe it's just me, I want to learn that. If there is a way to learn how to be content in any kind of circumstances, not happy, not, hey, I'm glad it's happening, not bring on more, I'll have another please, not, I just want to be miserable, to be miserable. In other words, whatever the circumstances we have no control over, if there is a way, this is amazing, if there is a way on the inside to be okay, when things on the outside are not okay, I want to learn that. Where do I sign up for that? I'll be there whatever time that class starts. I will be there on the front row. If there is a way to learn to be content in whatever circumstances I'm in, and Paul says, I just want you to know, whether you ever learn it or not, it exists. Whether you ever get there or not, whether you pay attention to anything else I write, I just want you to know, there is a category of contentment that works in all circumstances. Now, is it just me? Doesn't that make you want to lean in a little bit? Like, tell me what that is? I mean, that's amazing. What that means is this, that in the meantime, when you find yourself in that set of circumstances where there's no way forward, no way out, and there's nothing you can do about it, it just is what it is, there is a way to be content. Now, this is important. Not apathetic. Paul was not apathetic. Not, oh, well, whatever. Paul was not, oh, well, whatever. Okay, this is the guy that was going to single-handedly win the whole world to Jesus. Very ambitious guy. When he wasn't a Christian, he was going to kill them all. When he became a Christian, he was going to win them all. Okay, he's a man of extremes. But he said, in spite of my personality and in spite of my circumstances, I have learned the secret. I've learned how to be content. That's a powerful statement. He goes on. He says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. Now, this is a big statement, too. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Here's what he's saying. He said, I've had more than I needed, and I didn't get addicted to having more than I needed so that when I was in need, I was unhappy. I've learned to navigate having a lot, and I've learned to navigate not having enough. Having a lot didn't wreck my contentment. Having less than I needed didn't wreck my contentment. He goes on, I have learned, and I love this, this is so cool. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Now, this is really cool. In the Greek text, the Apostle Paul reaches outside of biblical literature and actually reaches outside of any kind of theologically, accurate Christian literature, and he grabs a word from culture that it shows up nowhere else in the entire New Testament. Now, the reason that's important is if you're having a conversation at work or at home and you use like a big 5-syllable word that's unusual for you to use, isn't it interesting how people are like, whoa, where'd that word come from? It's like they stop the conversation like, you rarely get out of the 2-syllable vocabulary. That was like 4 syllables. Wow. And it's like, hey, wait a minute, I just threw in, it just kind of used my word. I got that little thing on my phone pops up. I'm trying to say them correctly. I don't think that's how you say that. But anyway, I'm trying to, expand my vocabulary. Isn't it interesting when you throw out kind of, a big word, people kind of stop? Well, in the same way, the Apostle Paul, every once in a while in his literature, will introduce a word that he never uses anywhere else and that basically no biblical writer uses anywhere else. And his point is to get people to stop and go, wow, you're introducing something new. You're trying to make a big point. And the term that he uses here, actually, it's just one Greek word that's translated, learn the secret of being content. It's just one Greek word, and it's a word that was only used. It was only used in cultic mysticism to describe somebody being initiated into some kind of secret society or a secret cult. It's somebody, if you went through Rush, and you joined a fraternity or sorority, there was kind of that mystical moment where you got the secret handshake and the deal, and, you thought, am I in a gang or a sorority? What are we doing, So, that whole thing, and don't tell anybody, and this is kind of our secret. Or maybe when you were growing up and you had your, the girl hater club and the tree fort, and you kind of had your secret stuff. So this word was a Greek word that described, or was only used in cultic mysticism to talk about a secret thing going on. So the Apostle Paul grabs that word, places it in this context, and essentially, here's what he's saying. He's saying that I have been initiated into the cult of contentment. I have been initiated into this secret knowledge, this secret experience, this thing that's available to other people, but not a whole lot of people know about it. I have been initiated into this kind of cult of contentment, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty. And then, after we were all kind of leaning in like, what is it? What is it? What is it? Teach us, what's the secret? I promise I won't tell anybody, but I want to know, how can I be content in any and every circumstance? How can I survive the kind of stuff you're surviving? I mean, Paul, before you were arrested, you just kept getting the stuff beat out of you, and you were stoned and left for dead, and a snake would bite you, and you'd be shipwrecked, and people would throw you out of the city, and you have to escape over walls. And then, that was on a good day. And then on a bad day, you were actually arrested and brought to Rome. And if you've lost your friends, you just hope you get some mail. How in the world can you be content with all of that? And in the next verse, he tells us. And the next verse is one of the most famous verses in the entire New Testament. It is also perhaps one of the most misapplied verses in all of literature. This is one of those verses that you've probably heard in some way, shape, or form. You've seen it written somewhere. And unfortunately, it's so pithy. It's so easy to remember. People have yanked it way out of context and applied it to all kinds of stuff. But the context for this verse that perhaps you've heard before or heard somebody say before, the context for this is the Apostle Paul's summary of how you live with contentment in the midst of circumstances that are chaotic and, in his case, actually life-threatening. So you ready? Here it is. So tell us how, Paul. I can do all this. All what? Oh, persecuted and run out of town and stoned and left for dead. None of my friends will talk to me. Nobody's about to marry me. Are you kidding? Who wants to be my wife? I just live a very lonely life, and I'm here and there, and I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if I'm going to make it out of here. But I can do all of this. I can do all this and maintain my commitment. I'm not striving. I'm not tempted to disobey. I'm not tempted to compromise. I'm not tempted to say, Nero is Lord. Can I go home now? I can do all of this through him. Maybe if you grew up in church with the King James Bible, it said through Christ. A later manuscript, they took out him and put in Christ so everybody knows Christ, and that's who he's talking about. I can do all of this. I can survive all of this. I can maintain my commitment, my contentment through Christ who gives me strength. Literally, if I could add a word, Paul, you can talk about it when I get to heaven, okay? I want to just add one word for clarification. Who gives me his strength. Because Paul would later elaborate in other books that he wrote that became part of the New Testament, he would elaborate that there is a mystery. This is why he chose that word, that mysterious, that sort of cultic initiation. There's a mystery for believers. There's a mystery for Christians where actually the life of Jesus, the strength of Jesus, the endurance of Jesus is available to you and available to me in Christ. So he says, so I can do all of this through him or Christ who gives me his strength.